Imagine fighting against a country you were taught to hate, then suddenly, after being captured, you were taken thousands of miles away, across the ocean, to the land you were told was your enemy. You expect hunger. You expect cruelty. You expect prison walls, cold rooms, and punishment. But instead, you see something that completely changes the way you think about the war. You see American cities. You see supermarkets filled with food. You see ordinary families living normal lives. You see workers, children, cars, electricity, and a level of comfort you never imagined existed. For thousands of German soldiers captured during World War II, arriving in America was one of the most shocking moments of their lives, because the America they discovered was not the America they had imagined. This is the story of the German prisoners of war who came to the United States, and the strange, unexpected reality they experienced behind American barbed wire. Maps showing Europe to America. During World War II, millions of soldiers from Germany, Italy, Japan, and the Allied nations fought across the globe. The conflict destroyed entire cities, separated families, and changed the world forever. By 1943 and 1944, Allied forces were capturing increasing numbers of German soldiers. After major battles in North Africa, Italy, and later after the D-Day invasion, thousands of German troops surrendered. But there was a problem. The United States and its allies suddenly had hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and keeping them all in Europe was difficult. So America made a decision. Many German prisoners would be transported across the Atlantic Ocean and held in prisoner of war camps inside the United States. For these German soldiers, the journey itself was unbelievable. Many had never seen the ocean before. They were leaving behind the destruction of Europe and entering a country they had only heard about through propaganda. The journey across the Atlantic was long and uncertain. Many prisoners, where are we going? What will happen to us? Will the Americans punish us? German propaganda had often described the United States as a dangerous enemy. They were told Americans were weak, selfish, and had no understanding of war, but reality was about to challenge everything they believed. When the ships finally arrived, they saw something unexpected. America. A country that had not been destroyed by bombs, a country full of factories, a country producing cars, airplanes, food, and supplies at a massive scale. For many German prisoners, this was their first moment of realizing maybe everything we were told was not true. Arrival at American port as German POWs stepped into American soil, many expected guards to treat them harshly, but instead they often encountered something surprising: organization, clean facilities, medical care, and even basic respect. Of course, they were still prisoners. They could not leave. They had to follow strict rules that, compared with what many soldiers had experienced on the Eastern Front, American camps felt completely different. The biggest shock was not just how they were treated, it was what they saw around them. Many German prisoners were transported through American towns on their way to camps, and what they saw amazed them. Stores full of products, people buying food, families driving cars, children going to school, farmers working in huge fields. They saw in a country where daily life continued despite the war. For German soldiers who came from a Europe filled with destruction, this was almost impossible to understand. Back home, many cities were damaged. Millions of civilians were suffering. Food shortages were common. But here in America, there was abundance. One German prisoner later described seeing American farms and being shocked by their size. To him, an American farm looked almost like a small village. Large machines worked the fields. Huge amounts of food were produced. The scale of American agriculture showed the power of the American economy. And this was only one part of what surprised them. The United States was producing weapons, vehicles, ships, and aircraft at a level the world had never seen. Factories operated day and night. Workers built machines that would help defeat Nazi Germany. To many German prisoners, this industrial power was one of the biggest surprises. They had expected a country full of ordinary civilians. Instead, they found a nation capable of supporting a global war. But perhaps the biggest surprise came from everyday life. American prisoners' camps were not luxury resorts. They were military facilities. Guards were present. Rules were enforced. Escape attempts happened, but many German POWs noticed something different. They were being treated according to international agreements. They received food, they received shelter, they had medical treatment. Some camps even allowed educational programs, sports, and cultural activities. For some prisoners, this experience created a completely different image of America. Historical explanation: the United States had more than 400,000 Axis prisoners during World War II. Many were placed in camps across different states, including places like Texas, Arizona, and other regions. The reason America brought prisoners so far away was practical. Europe was a battlefield. The United States had space, resources, and security. Keeping prisoners in America also prevented them from returning to fight. Inside the camps, daily life followed a routine. Prisoners woke up. Meals were served. Work assignments were given. Inspections happened. Some prisoners worked on farms or helped with labor shortages. During the war, American farmers and industries needed workers because millions of American men were serving overseas, so POW labor helped support some parts of the economy. But the relationship between American guards and German prisoners was complicated. Some guards hated the enemy because they had lost friends and family in the war. Others viewed the prisoners simply as soldiers following orders. The experiences varied from camp to camp. Some prisoners faced strict treatment. Others developed friendships with guards and local Americans. For many German soldiers, the biggest change happened inside their minds. Before coming to America, many had only known one version of the United States, a version created by wartime propaganda. But after seeing America themselves, they began questioning what they had been told. They realized ordinary Americans were not monsters. They were people. They had families. They worked. They laughed. They lived normal lives. And this human connection was something propaganda could not erase. But the biggest surprise for German POWs was still waiting, because inside some American camps, something happened that changed thousands of prisoners forever. Some prisoners who arrived as enemies would leave America with a completely different view of the country. Some would even return years later, not as soldiers, but as visitors. And the story of how that happened is one of the most fascinating chapters of World War II history. For many German soldiers captured during World War II, America was supposed to be the land of their enemy, a place they had been taught to fear. A country they believed was filled with people who wanted to destroy Germany. But when they arrived, something unexpected happened. The prisoners began seeing a completely different reality. They discovered that behind the uniforms, flags, and politics, there were simply ordinary people on both sides. That inside the American prisoner of war camps, thousands of German soldiers experienced something they never expected, a chance to learn, work, and see the world from a different perspective. The United States created hundreds of prisoner facilities during the war. Many were located far away from major cities. Places like Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona, and other states became temporary homes for captured German soldiers. To Americans living nearby, seeing German prisoners in their communities was a strange experience too. For many civilians, the war had always felt far away. They had heard about battles in Europe through newspapers and radio, but suddenly the enemy was standing right in front of them. American towns near Cam. Some local Americans were suspicious. After all, these men had fought against Allied forces. They wore German uniforms. Some had been members of the German military for years. But over time, many people realized something important, that not every German soldier was the same. Some had joined because of military duty. Some had been drafted. Some had different beliefs from the Nazi leadership. The prisoners were individuals with their own stories. One of the biggest surprises for German POWs was the amount of food available in American camps. Many soldiers had experienced shortages during the war. They had seen destroyed villages, hungry civilians, and exhausted armies. But American camps often provided regular meals. The contrast was shocking. Some prisoners later remember being amazed by simple things: fresh bread, coffee, fruit, large portions of food. For soldiers who had spent years fighting in difficult conditions, this felt almost unbelievable. Another major surprise was American agriculture. Many German prisoners came from European farming backgrounds, but American farms looked enormous compared with what they knew. Large fields stretched across the landscape. Machines replaced much of the manual labor. Tractors, harvesters, and modern equipment showed the industrial strength of America. To many prisoners, it was another sign that the United States had resources far beyond what they imagined. But the most surprising part of life in many camps was education. American authorities allowed some prisoners to participate in classes. This was partly designed to reduce boredom and maintain order, but it had another effect. It exposed German soldiers to new ideas. Inside some camps, prisoners studied languages, mathematics, history, and other subjects. Libraries were created, books were available, lectures were organized. Some prisoners learned English, others discussed politics and the future of Germany. For many, it was the first time they had access to information outside wartime propaganda. Imagine spending years believing one version of the world, then suddenly being able to read newspapers, books, and opinions from another country. For some German soldiers, this experience completely changed their understanding. They started asking questions. Was the war really what we thought? Were we told the truth? What would happen after Germany? But not every prisoner accepted these changes. Some remained loyal to Nazi beliefs. Inside the camps, there were conflicts between different groups of prisoners. Some prisoners supported Nazi ideology, others rejected it. American authorities had to carefully manage these tensions. Camp daily routine, life inside the camps followed a strict schedule: morning roll calls, meals, work, training, recreation. The evening of inside barracks. The prisoners were not free. They could not simply walk away. Guards watched them constantly. But compared with the brutal conditions many had experienced during the war, some prisoners considered their situation surprisingly humane. One unusual part of the American camps was recreation. Prisoners played soccer. They organized music groups. They created artwork. They wrote letters. Some even built small communities inside the camps. For a short time, these places became strange little worlds separated from the war outside. One of the reasons these camps became memorable was because of the relationships formed between prisoners and Americans. Some American guards discovered they had more in common with German soldiers than they expected. They were similar ages, they had families, they had dreams. Many were young men who had been sent into a war created by powerful governments. The uniform had made them enemies, but personal conversations revealed their humanity. There were even cases where prisoners developed friendships with local civilians. Farmers who hired prisoners for work sometimes interacted with them daily. At first, people were cautious, but after months of seeing them work and behave respectfully, opinions changed. Some locals began seeing them less as enemies and more as people caught in history. Then, in 1945, everything changed. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended. For German prisoners in America, the future became uncertain. Then he wondered, would they stay? Would they return home? What would happen to Germany? The world they returned to would be completely different. Their homeland had been defeated. Cities were destroyed. Families were separated. The political system they had known had collapsed. And many prisoners had to face a difficult reality. The war they fought in had changed everything. But something unexpected happened after the war. Thousands of former German prisoners carried memories of America back with them. They remembered the camps. They remembered the people they met. They remembered the country they had once considered an enemy. And for some, those memories created a completely different relationship with the United States. Because years later, some of these former German POWs would do something almost impossible to imagine. They would return to America. Not as prisoners, not as enemies, but as visitors searching for the places where their lives had changed forever, and their stories revealed one of the most surprising human sides of World War II. When German POWs reached America, they saw something they never expected. Part 3. The German soldiers who returned to America after the war was over. The battles had ended. The weapons had gone silent. But for thousands of German prisoners of war who had spent time inside America, the memories remained. They remembered the strange feeling of arriving as enemies and leaving with a completely different understanding of the country they once feared. Years later, some of these former prisoners would make an unbelievable journey. They would return to America, not wearing a military uniform, not surrounded by guards, but as ordinary people coming back to a place that had changed their lives. Take Germany. After the war, when German prisoners finally returned home after World War II, they found a country that looked nothing like the one they had left. Germany was devastated. Cities that once represented power and history had been reduced to ruins. Millions of people were displaced. Families searched for missing relatives. The nation had to rebuild itself from the ground up. For many former soldiers, returning home was emotionally difficult. They carried memories of war, but they also carried memories of something unexpected: America. Many Germans had arrived in the United States expecting punishment. Instead, they experienced a country with enormous wealth, technology, and resources. They had seen factories producing endless supplies. They had seen farms larger than anything they knew. They had seen ordinary families living in a way that seemed impossible during wartime Europe. And those images stayed with them. Former prisoners talking years later. Some former POWs described their time in America as one of the most confusing experiences of their lives. They had been trained to see Americans as enemies, but the people they met did not match that image. They discovered kindness from unexpected places. They discovered conversations instead of hatred. They discovered that an enemy soldier could still be a human being. After the war, Germany entered a new era. The country was divided. The world entered the Cold War, and relations between Germany and the United States slowly changed. The same two nations that had fought a terrible war eventually became important partners, and some former German prisoners became part of this new relationship. American towns and former camps. Decades later, some former prisoners returned to the United States to visit the locations where they had once been held. For them, the journey was emotional. They were not returning to a prison. They were returning to a place filled with memories. They wanted to see the roads they traveled, the towns they passed through, the camps where they spent some of the most unusual years of their lives. Imagine standing in the same place where you arrived as a captured soldier, but now you are free. You are older. The world has changed. The people who were once your enemies are now welcoming you. For many former POWs, it was a powerful reminder of how much history can change. One of the most surprising parts of their stories was how they remembered ordinary Americans, not politicians, not generals, not famous leaders, but everyday people. The farmer who spoke to them, the guard who treated them fairly, the worker who showed them kindness. Small moments became the memories they carried for decades. American culture during WWII, the prisoners had also been amazed by American culture. They saw things that felt completely foreign. Large highways, cars everywhere, modern machines, entertainment, consumer products. The size and energy of American society surprised many Europeans. The United States was not only a military power, it was also a country with a completely different way of life. For some German prisoners, America became proof that the world was bigger than the propaganda they had grown up with. They learned that countries were not simply good or evil. People were more complicated. History was more complicated. And war often separated people who had more similarities than differences. Another unusual part of their experience was labor. During their time in America, many POWs worked in agriculture and other industries. This was allowed under wartime regulations. The work helped address labor shortages caused by millions of American men serving overseas. For prisoners, it was also a way to experience everyday American life. Instead of only seeing military facilities, they saw ordinary communities. Some prisoners even learned skills while in America. They improved their English. They learned about American customs. They built friendships. And when they returned to Germany, they brought these experiences with them. But perhaps the biggest lesson from the German POW experience was not about war. It was about human perception. Before coming to America, many prisoners saw the United States through the eyes of an enemy, and for living there, they saw something completely different. A nation made up of millions of individuals, people who had fears, people who had hopes, people who wanted a better future. World War II was one of the darkest chapters in human history. Millions died. Entire nations were destroyed. The consequences lasted for generations. But hidden inside this massive conflict were thousands of personal stories. Stories of soldiers who crossed oceans as enemies and returned home carrying unexpected memories. The German POWs who reached America expected a land of hostility. Instead, many found something they never imagined, a country full of ordinary people, a country with incredible power, a country that challenged everything they had been told. And perhaps the greatest surprise of all was discovering that even after the worst wars in history, people from opposite sides could still find moments of understanding.